speakers. And having heard the talks, I'm going to move to the other microphone here. Is this on? Hello, is this working? How do we turn that? Just over there, just right there. Press your thing. Oh, wait, and hold it there. Yeah, there we go. Can we hear me? Yeah. It's mainly for the translations, which is why we have to use the microphones. I have at least 7 questions, but I'm not going to ask them because you've heard enough of me. Questions from the floor for any of the speakers in any order. Have we got any? Lady there. I could sit down, I suppose.
Yes, this is Iman Asi. I'm working at Dubai municipality actually, but I'm originally in Palestine. I work also on a lot of projects funded by international donors, especially in the time of Oslo Accord. And I have worked in many projects that funded by different donors, like the archive, the Palestinian archive. Thanks a lot because all of you are international donors. You touch on a very sensitive issues for donors to give money for countries or state. My question is actually coming from my experience, my personal experience. For you, which is better, to fund through NGOs or through state? I mean, because in Palestine we have different channels. It's either through the Palestinian state or NGOs. And what are the difference? Because usually, I mean, I'm not really criticizing you, but usually the donors have their agenda, and the local community and the people who are getting the fund has their agenda. Do you find sometimes conflicts between these two agendas? I don't know. For me, I mean, I found some conflicts in Palestine when it comes to Hamas. I mean, some donors, they said, no, we don't want to give to Hamas. I mean, it's not Hamas, it's the people who are benefiting it. So how far you can go with this? I really like what you comment on coordination and to avoid the duplication, because this is the case was in Palestine. There is a lot of duplication in many projects, especially because it goes through NGOs. There is no public policy for channeling this fund. And my last comment was on the administrative fees. The administrative fees is really too much. I mean, it's like, and the conditions, I think it's 12% to 20%, the administrative fees. And if you want to buy like a car, it has to be from the donors. If you want to bring an international consultant, it has to be from the, so I mean, there are certain conditions that the effectiveness of the money, it could be much better if you think about, because I really like the mechanism, what kind of mechanism you should really reconsider in the future. And my last, actually, I remember it's the impact. Did you really try to find some impact assessments for your projects? I mean, this is really interesting. How much the local community has really benefited from your project. And thanks a lot.
Thank you. Some very interesting comments and questions. Who wants to answer the question of NGOs or governments? Amy, you look poised.
Hello, thank you for the question. I would say we don't have a policy of working with a certain type of organization, but probably in our experience, it's easier and more practical to work with NGOs and different similar types of organizations. I think they tend to have the experience of making applications and the connections, I suppose, to the community as well. So for us, that's been easier.
Yeah, go on. You want to comment?
Okay, so I mean, it's a little. So Arcadia, as I said, is a private funder, and we, as long as we are convinced that these are the best people for the job, we will basically go with whoever is the best and most convincing. We really don't have many rules. We are this is the advantage of working with private philanthropy. We do require hard proofs that these are the people who have access to heritage, who have the local credibility, and this is completely. This is not in terms of MENA region or Palestine, but generally we find that there is, especially where we work with minorities, working with government can be problematic. So and sometimes it's a balancing act. So perhaps there is, which you have to also factor in. So maybe the most stable institution in the region is the government or governmental agency, but this is not the institution that the community is going to trust. And sometimes we try to redress it if we think that there is a chance, but sometimes we find it easier to talk to the community and say, okay, so who is the partner that you would be prepared to work with?
Very good answer.
As the new kid on the block, I'm full of good intentions and ambitions, and I think we can and should do things differently. So take what I say with a grain of salt, meaning that this is the aim and this is the desire. And next year I can come back and tell you if we've succeeded in this. But I think my long experience from being on the other side gives me a perspective of, if I'm the donor, then I don't want to expect unrealistic things from the person or the institution we're funding. So I'm very careful with that. When you talked about administration, I forgot to mention that we're going to go for 10% maximum overheads. So we're not going to be in the business of funding the existence of institution. We're going to be in the business of funding actions on the ground and work. And for this, because you asked about agendas, we're going to try to have one agenda, and it's the cultural property protection agenda. So whoever can better serve that agenda is going to be the partners we're going to try to work with. But you hit the nail on the head, you raise the conundrum of civil society, NGO, and government support. Ideally, if we fund an NGO to do a work, it's a work that is accepted and welcomed by the community, as you mentioned, but it should also be welcomed and if not at the worst, tolerated by public powers. It's really important that whatever we do is not seen as intervening against the will of nations, because if we don't, respect some kind of will and desire of nation state, where are we going? So we're going to try to, ideally, make sure that the cultural heritage protection is something that is welcomed by a government, and then see who is best placed to implement this work that needs to be done. And usually this can be easily accepted by government if they feel that they're not the best placed. But we need to involve them every step of the way. If we want this to be sustainable, they need to support it. So ideally, I would say, if NGOs can do concrete things on the ground, they're going to be privileged, but it's really important that they communicate and coordinate and try to involve local powers if possible.
That's great. Oh yeah, Amy wants to add something.
I just wanted to say, likewise, we do very much take a collaborative approach. And when you mentioned NGOs, I was sort of focusing on that. But we're very happy to we have several projects which have government departments as partners. It's just in our experience as the lead applicant organization, it's been more practical. Yeah.
And it seems to me that the overall approach depends on the NGO, depends on the government, but it's down to what the project is going to deliver. You've also raised, and France mentioned overhead, so let's not discuss that, but you raised impact. How do you measure impact? And I think Amy might comment on that, because the Cultural Protection Fund has an evaluation process, which is very useful. So do you want to talk about evaluation?
Yes, so we have developed an evaluation process. So when a grant is awarded, we sit down with the grantee and develop an evaluation plan for the project. And that will be based on the objectives that they have set out for the project and the various types of indicators and evidence that they plan to collect along the course of the project. And then our team based in the UK and also in our country offices, we work with them throughout the project to sort of monitor how they're progressing against that. And then it's a requirement at the end of the project that they deliver an evaluation plan, and they have to set aside a certain amount of the budget in order to produce that. And that's a really useful tool for them, learning for future projects, but also for us in order to measure the impact of the fund and to look at areas that haven't worked and areas of unmet need so that we can plan for the future.
So we ask for impact as a part of the proposal. So, our proposal is a structure. I mean, this is bog standard for the industry, I believe. We pay grants in annual installments, and the proposal is structured to stipulate the outcomes for every year. But we also ask for impact. So, and this is to say that, there is a desired impact at the beginning, but of course this impact can change. And the important part of our reporting is asking, what have you learned from the project? Which is probably going beyond the impact. But this is to say that the impact is not only in the outcomes, but also in the process, because there is a lot of most of the things that you are all doing are new. And it's not, we might set up with one process, one action plan, but this has to be tweaked and changed during the work. And what we learned to see as very important is this learning process as a large part of the impact, because this informs future work on heritage.
Thank you. George, you've got the microphone, so I presume you're about to ask a question.
Thank you, yes. Well, thank you very much for those wonderful presentations and so many fascinating projects in different countries in the region and around the world. And I very much appreciated that all of the three donor organizations mentioned the importance of collaborating with local organizations. But I couldn't help notice that most of the projects mentioned have as the lead partner a Western institution, whether it's a university or a museum from Europe or the US. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the critique that structure of funding perpetuates a certain supremacy of Western institutions over local ones. So my question is, and I'm sure that there are some examples that will detract from this overall trend, but how can we shift the paradigm so that in general, the lead organization in receiving funding and applying for funding is the local one, supported by, in a secondary role, the Western institution, and therefore try and empower local institutions in a more sustainable way? Thank you.
Wow, who wants to comment on that first?
So, as I say, that we try to, for us, the approach is really pragmatic. And pragmatically speaking, at this point of time, the institutions in Europe and America are better placed to do part of what is important for us. That is to say, long-term preservation. If we ever are in a discussion with an organization outside Europe and America that can provide credible guarantees, then absolutely they can be the lead grantee. It's only that so far we haven't come across an organization like that. But what you say, I mean, it's again, we would like to move away from this being us versus them. Most of the projects we have are in a partnership. We talk to both sides. It's just that in formal terms, in practical terms, someone has to sign the piece of paper. But it's really, as I hope I made it clear in the conversation, we never believe that it's the Western, sorry for lack of better term, a Western institution that teaches the local partner because in most cases, frankly, it was the European institution that had a lot to learn from the local partner, because it is the local partner that knows the heritage. And I think that's, it's not a criticism of your question, but I think that there is a danger in perceiving, we are all in this together, and we should move to approaching this as this is a community of heritage preservation, this is a community of knowledge, this is a community of history preservation, whatever you call it. It's not the the European institution West versus non-European. We should all, both people who ask the question that you very rightly ask, and both people who fund and work in the heritage should perhaps move away from this division.
Amy, do you want to say anything?
Sure. Just to add to that, I would say when we first launched the Cultural Protection Fund, it was very much sort of UK news, and the sort of expressions of interest that we received at the beginning were very much coming from UK organisations. However, just over the past 2.5 years, the number of expressions of interest that we've started to receive from within those 12 countries that we're focusing on at the moment has just skyrocketed. And we are now in a position where 30% of the projects that we fund are actually being delivered directly by organizations in the countries. And I hope that if we do receive further funding in the future, that number will really grow. And also, I think all the partners that are involved, and even the ones that are led by Western organizations, have a really significant role to play, and in some cases are more leading the projects, and it's just easier administratively and financially if the funding goes to a different organization in some cases, depending on the sort of financial setup within that country.
Thank you. And as somebody who is gamekeeper turned poacher, because I used to be a grant giver for the Heritage Lottery Fund, it is about the communities and the bottom up, and it doesn't matter whether they come from Cornwall or Palestine or wherever else, it's about those communities. And I think, as Amy's just said, it's finding the appropriate method to deliver that project, and that's maybe the way we should view it. Francis.
Yeah. I'll be the pragmatic Canadian that I am here and offer a very pragmatic response to a political question, of course, but it all comes down to reality. And right now, I'm trying to help regions of the world where I cannot physically wire money. I cannot physically transfer funds everywhere or anywhere to anyone. There needs to be, oversight, accountability at a minimum, although ALIF has decided, to keep bureaucracy at the very minimum, but if there's public funds involved, there needs to be accountability and responsibility. This is really important. So we're trying to be creative in seeing how we can deliver those results on the ground, involving the community, and foregoing the administration reservations that we could have. We're working in countries, with endemic corruption in certain cases, and sometimes it's the governments who tell us, find a way to get this done. Don't necessarily wire the money to us. We just need it to happen and see the light. And sometimes there's an acknowledgement from the local government that they know that this is not necessarily the best way, transferring the money directly in the country, and we're trying to find ways. So there's creative ways in Iraq, for example, not to name it, we've been able to, but no, this is also about involving it's not about wiring money, it's about transferring the knowledge and working with them. They're the ones, teaching us, and we're only supporting them in doing their work. If you need something to, close the hole on the roof of the Mosul Museum, which was done yesterday, thanks to just a little bit of fund, was done locally by the people in charge at the State Board of Antiquities, but with support from the Smithsonian Institution, and will be done with support from ALIF. So in Nimrud, I know that they worked from a base in Erbil, and it was the Iraqis who would go back and forth and be supported. So we're trying to find creative ways of working together. You're absolutely right. It's not about us and them. And this has been bothering me for a while, because when I was working on similar issues, it's about shared heritage. People talk about shared heritage when there's a shared responsibility. And we're told it's a shared responsibility, the world needs to help do this, but there's no shared ownership. The ownership is national, legally. It's their heritage legally. So we agree that it's a shared history and we need to share the responsibility, but we need to make sure we don't do that divide of us and them, and that we are all in this together to make sure that the end result sees the day. So this is just the approach, but I'm glad you raised this question. And the last thing I'm going to say, if you have a list of local NGOs able to restore buildings, please send them to me. I'm dying to get my hands on really local actors who are going to be willing and able and available to deliver.
Okay. I think that's a really, really good question, actually. It's quite a poignant question. I think it's a difficult one to answer, but I think it's a situation that does need resolution, and it certainly is the way forward, because again, it's local communities that care for these monuments. They're the ones that are going to be responsible for them. So to some extent, maybe it's identifying local stakeholders, as France is saying. Maybe it's through the development of conferences directly with those stakeholders as well, bringing them in the first instance. And obviously, you want stakeholders that have you can recognise their ability to deliver within that as well. So I think it's a great question, actually, and one that does need we do need to move forward in that direction, absolutely.
And I know we're being broadcast, but there will be answers that we could give. I was going to give an anecdote, but I can't do it in public, so have a chat to me over coffee.
Thank
question.
you. I have a question on the dialogue between funders and project leaders, because very often we find ourselves with guidelines, priorities, and specifications that are already set and that are not necessarily in line with what we see in our field work. And it's sometimes very difficult to discuss priorities with funders. Take a country like Iraq, for example. We see that a lot of the funding is directed towards religious minorities and their heritage. And we found ourselves in a situation where, if I do a 3D scan of a church, I'm more likely to get funding than if I do a 3D scan of a mosque. So should I scan as many churches as I can to get funding, or should I try and discuss with funders to shift priorities and have a more balanced approach to how communities get supported? And then it's a very, very large debate that goes well beyond what we do at Econem, but it's a real question that we face with countries like Iraq or Syria in other respects. So it's really, I would like to have your views on this.
Anybody wish to comment on the priorities? Very important issue in terms of how priorities are set. I could see why panel members might not want to do that.
I'm not going to answer this question because I can't, because we develop our projects and you can't apply to to Arcadia, and therefore our projects are developed in a dialogue, and we never set the priorities. We basically try to identify the best partner to do the project, but we listen to them. And the other thing is, if we are convinced, they do need to convince us. It's not that they tell us what they're going to do and we necessarily always agree, as Bob well knows. Usually it is a process of discussion. So we listen, but we do need to hear good arguments. But my advice is that you should not compromise. It's not the funder's place to commission projects, because you are the ones who know what happens on the ground and what is needed on the ground. And you would be shooting, as funders, you would be shooting ourselves in the foot if we say, well, on the basis of our general knowledge of the field, this is what we should do, where in reality our knowledge is by its very nature limited because we are not on the ground. So I would say always engage in a discussion, and I'm sure that there is a way of doing that.
Yeah, no, I wasn't sure if I completely understood the question, but in terms of funders' priorities, I mean, for us, I guess it's coming down to the type of funding that we're delivering, you know, which we're offering, and that official development assistance. So for us, the key priority is the benefit, you know, for that country, and seeing the evidence that there's the local need. So what does that local need come from? It could take many different forms. It could be from the local community, but it could also say it fits in with a wider government strategy. So I guess we're quite flexible in how we interpret that, but we definitely need to see that it's driven locally.
But it does remind me of times at HLF where, and if you look on the Heritage Lottery Fund, things of what they won't fund, and they won't fund something that's either promoting religion and politics. And that's maybe something that actually funders do bear in mind. They may not be explicit about it, but it has to show balance and fairness, and that's the key thing. Anybody else want to comment? Another question quickly, because time is running. Michael.
Can I have a quick question about economic sustainability? One of the contradictions that we're facing in projects in Sudan is that digital technology needs to be maintained in the country where it's actually being preserved. To do that, the people who maintain it need to have some kind of income, and to do that, they have to be able to sell the digital recordings they have, or make some commercial benefit from it. And there's an implicit contradiction from your requirement that it should be no pay for access, and the desires of the institutions who are keeping and looking after this digital technology, because actually digital technology doesn't last unless someone on the ground is actually looking after it, because as you know, basically unless someone's keeping buying new hard drives, it'll just evaporate. So basically, you know, like your hotel key card, you know, unless it's recharged regularly, the whole thing just disappears. And somehow, how are you going to create that economy locally? And just on top of that, talking about local NGOs and local governments, the local government in Sudan, the only income the staff have for the museum is from working for international agencies. So the local staff don't get paid or get paid nothing. And the only money they have is from working for the international agencies such as yourselves. And that is not sustainable. But if the actual local institutions in the countries actually had an economy from their culture, and particularly their digital culture, which is available internationally, globally, which could bring finance into these institutions, you know, somehow there's an implicit contradiction in your policies. Sorry.
Yes, but the fundamental question is a good one, which is how do you make it sustainable?
For us, yes, economic sustainability is very important, and we don't have a policy which says you must not profit from what you've created with our funds. I mean, if you took the example of an exhibition that was being created, we would want to see that there was some free public access to the exhibition during the duration of the project that we're funding. However, we've negotiated, you know, depending on the local context and what is usual, we've negotiated that you could do this bit of it could be free for this period of time, but there could be a reasonable cost or a reasonable charge for seeing the exhibition at a different time. So we're very much, you know, supportive of people being able to, you know, sustain their work. For example, the Turquoise Mountain Trust project, they're gaining skills in marketing the work and the handicrafts that they've created. So we're very much supportive of that.
Can I just say that, I mean, with all due respect, I don't think that this is a model that is going to work, because this is a model, charging for access is a model, economic model that most of, again, for lack of a better word, Western institutions are moving away from, because it simply doesn't work. There is ample evidence, and we have made few test cases where we agreed to an embargo of 5 years, during which the projects could charge for access. It never worked. Basically, but what it does, it means that this heritage that you digitize is not accessible to everyone. There will be people who can't afford accessing their own heritage, and this is emphatically what we don't want to happen. There are, however, other ways of thinking about this, and what we have always found is that if our projects make their materials openly accessible, there are then ways of using the platform, digital platforms, for making funds in other ways, so for applying for other funding, because other funders can see what it is that the institution has. but also for, we would never prohibit anyone from selling large scale prints or whatever it is that they want to produce. And then it is, to us, it seems it's a better model. Certainly from our experience, it's a model that worked better for the partners that we worked with. So I will be very careful and investing in a model where you charge for access, because this model in itself is rather expensive to keep, and it is unlikely to produce revenue that will make this sustainable.
I'd agree with that. Actually, the selling data is not a sustainable model, but it does need to be sustainable. You're absolutely correct. If we look at archaeological sites, heritage sites, there's very, very few of those that actually make money and a profit out of the gate when you're going into that. Where the actual income comes from is all the small shops around there, the tour guides, the restaurants, the hotels, the flights, the tour operators, and so on. And this is the real value, and this is where the sustainable side of it should actually come from.
Sorry, just use the mic, Mike, because you haven't got one, and then just for the translation, and then we'll have one question. This will be the last question.
Sorry, I was just saying is the problem is that you're correct, and I'm not saying in any way what you're saying is wrong. What I'm trying to say is, how do you persuade the government that the sustainability on the grassroots level, which is where the problem is, because basically the governments we work with don't invest in their cultural heritage organisations at all. I mean, zero, and possibly negative zero. So the question is, how do you actually, if they can't see any benefit from it, how can you encourage them to see it as a benefit? And that is the question, and that I'm really trying to ask.
And I don't think we'll answer it this morning. So one final question from Amin, and then we'll go to the conference announcement, and then you can get your coffee.
ممكن ملاحظة صغيرة بالنسبة للاستدامة في هذا. ممكن ملاحظة صغيرة بالنسبة للاستدامة في هذا الموضوع، ودائما إشراك المجتمع المحلي في المشاريع التي تتم في المواقع التراثية. عادة لما يكون أهل المنطقة نفسهم مشركين في المشروع الذي يتم تمويله واستثماره، أعتقد بيتم تحقيق نوع من الاستدامة في هذا المجال. بالنسبة لمداخلتي فيما يخص إعداد التقارير اللازمة لجلب المستثمرين والداعمين للمشاريع في المناطق، خاصة المناطق اللي معرضة للنزاع، شو في إمكانية كمانحين من تدريب وتأهيل العاملين في القطاع الحكومي أو الخاص لكيفية إعداد التقارير لرفعها للجهات المانحة، ليتم يعني تسهيل العمل في إعداد التقارير. شكرا.
Shukran jazilan. Thank you very much. You also touched a very good point yesterday. I'm grateful that you're here. It's exactly what you said. Why do foreign NGOs get funded more? Because they have the know-how of preparing project proposal. I mean, this is something the CPF has seen in a region. I remember being at a meeting and saying, why is this country getting so many project funded when we know that there are more needs elsewhere? Well, because this country has know-how, and they proposed, much more. So you're right, we need to find a way. This is something we're trying to address in making it as accessible and as easy as possible to apply, knowing that on my slide I mentioned that there would be an iterative process. We need to accept that the proposal that a local partner would put in is not going to be perfect. And if we think there's a good idea there and there's something there, we're going to, I know that the CPF works very hard on doing this. How can we improve it with them? How can we work with them to make sure that we get to the result of the quality of proposal that we can put on the table to our committee who's going to approve it. But you're right, we also need to find a way to make sure we build capacity in requesting funds and in reporting to funders about this, because otherwise we'll be stuck in this vicious circle.
Anybody else want to comment? Amy?
Yes, I would add to say that it's a challenge, definitely. As Franz mentioned, we do think about this. We have two different tiers of grants. We have smaller grants and larger grants, and so for the smaller ones, there is still a process involved, but we do try to be more flexible with that grant amount. That's under the £100,000 mark. And we also offer sessions. I wish we could do more, but at this point we do offer sessions once expressions of interest come in. If we say that sounds like a good idea, then we can set up Skype sessions and using different technologies where people can phone in and ask questions. And Catriona delivers some of these sessions where we look at what makes a good application and what do we mean by the project budget and what do we mean by this document. And so I hope that in the future, if we do get more funding, we can continue on this path and try to dedicate more resource to it.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to draw this to a close, but it has been a fascinating morning, and I'm sure more discussions can go on in private that aren't broadcast. And we've had a really good demonstration of how successful funding can come from being tapped on the shoulder by Maja saying, will you do this, to the government way of, and the CPF model, which is fantastic, and then the ALIF model, which is emergency and an annual call. Just before we started, Franz and I were chatting, and if I could sum it up, it's not how much you have, it's what you do with it. And that's what I take away from today, so thank you all. And before we go to the conference, oh yes, a quick advert. As if the queue from here to Geneva isn't going to be long enough, there are these outside somewhere. Where are they? Somewhere outside, so do pick them up. But can we thank our speakers and panel for a very stimulating morning. Thank you very much. Thank you.